Hi, I'm Shelley Orr with the Catawba County Library System. In honor of National Sewing Month, I'm going to show you how to make a washable cotton mask. So let's talk supplies. For this project, you'll need a pattern, cotton fabric, scissors, and a sewing machine. To get us started, we need to trace and cut the pattern. I use at least 8" by 8" cotton fabric in contrasting colors. One's for the lining and one's for the outer fabric. The next thing I do is lay my pattern on one set of fabric, so two of the same color, and trace it with a Sharpie. And then I just use my scissors to cut it out. With this pattern, you can see that the lining is a little bit shorter than the outer fabric, and that just helps reduce the bulk for the casing that we'll use for our elastic. So after you cut out your pattern, what you want to do is make sure that the right sides of the fabric are together. So this is the right side of the fabric inside, and then this is the wrong side of the fabric. And then what we're going to do is sew this center seam and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance as we sew that center seam. We'll do the same thing with the lining fabric. Make sure that your lining fabric has its right sides together. You have your little sandwich, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch to the edge of the center seam. So I have a 1/4 inch foot that I like to use when I do any quilting or anything with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But if you don't have a little foot like that, you can just take a ruler and put your needle down, and then you're going to measure a 1/4 inch, and you'll see where that is on your plate. My lines don't go that far, but you can definitely see where it is, and you can line it up. So I'm using a standard straight stitch as I sew this. And what I'm going to do is, because I have this foot, I'm going to butt up the edge of the mask, the center seam, and I'm going to put my needle down, and I am going to go forward, do a little back stitch to lock that in, and then just zoom around. And I'm just guiding it with my fingers to let it slowly go around that curve. And I'm going to do a little back stitch with this and let it go forward. Now I'm going to use the other one, the interfacing or the lining. So now I'm just going to keep sewing with the lining. I don't want them sewn together, so I'm going to take a couple stitches with the front of it and then just feed the lining through. Do a back stitch to lock it in place. And then just go around that curve, gently guiding it with my fingers. Like that. Let me cut these. So now they're kind of sewn together like that, but it makes it easy if you're sewing a lot of them. It's called chain piecing. I learned it from making quilts. So anytime you have fabric that you've sewn together and it's on a curve, you'll want to clip the curve, and that just helps the seam go down correctly. So what I'll do is I take my scissors and I go, let's see if I can get really close. I go almost up to the stitching, but not cutting the stitching, and I'm going to cut just a little bit into the seam. I do it 3 or 4 times. Like that. And that's all it is. Just something that you do when you sew on a curve. And now I can kind of finger press. I turned it inside out, and I'm going to finger press my seams to one side. And each of these will have opposite sides. Let me do that, and we'll speed this up. We'll turn it just like that. That'll be the outside. And one thing I like to do for the top one is actually top stitch this center seam. You don't have to, but I just like the way it looks. So I'll show you how that looks. So I'm going to show you with the interfacing or the lining of it, just because it's lighter and you can see it. So I've finger pressed my seams to the right, And what I'm going to use is I'm going to use this seam line as my guide, and I'm just going to stitch it about 1/8 of an inch to the right of the center seam line. And I'm not super accurate, and I'm also lucky that I have a little red line here that I line up on my seam. But you can just eyeball it. And I'm just going to sew that. Do a little back stitch. And as I'm sewing it, I'm stretching it out just because I haven't pressed it. And that way we don't get a big gap. And you see I can move it around as I'm going through. It takes a little practice, but you'll get it. And so this is what it looks like. It's just a way to finish the seam so it doesn't unravel, but I haven't had too much of an issue with that. And oh my goodness, it's not straight, but that's okay. So the next thing that we're going to do is sew the two pieces together, and we're going to sew it on the bottom and we're going to sew it on the top. And so what you need to do is make sure you have right sides together. So once again, our right sides are together, and I will line my center seams up and then line the bottom up so it's like this. And you can pin it if you'd like. I don't pin it just because I'm a wild card like that, but it's only about this much that you can hold on to. So I'm going to sew the bottom first, and then I'm going to sew the top. And once again, we're going to use that 1/4 inch seam again. So 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you see also that our lining is shorter than our outer fabric, because this will make the casing that you put the elastic or the t-shirt through. So once again, I'm lining these center seams up, making sure that the bottoms are on the edge and even. And I'm going to drop my needle down and sew that 1/4 inch seam. Do a little back stitch. And since I haven't pinned, I always just kind of play with the fabric a little bit as we go to make sure that I have it where it needs to be. So once again, moving the fabric, or if you pin it, you won't have to do that. We're jumping over the seam. Now this top part, because it is curved, you'll get a bit of a play with it, but make sure your center seams match up. So check. And then just make sure the edges line up, and we will do that 1/4 inch seam again. Do a little back stitch. And as you sew around your curve, you can slow down as much as you need to make sure you get it where it needs to be. So we've got this curve that's at the top, and just slowly going over that, and then just checking my fabric again. And when you don't want to pull your fabric too much, because it can make it a little wonky. Okay, so once again, we've got some curves right here. We just need to make a couple of cuts. You're going to cut it almost to where you've sewn it, and just a couple of cuts on one side of the seam, and then a couple of cuts on the other side of the seam. Like that. You can see, just helps it. And then we're going to turn this right side out. And so I just take it and I push the fabric through. And you can see this is our outside, and this is our lining here. I'm going to make sure that it's all out. There you go. So this is what would be where your nose would go. And you can see it's got that area for that. And what I like to do is just finger press. So I'm making sure that the seams, like I'm pushing the seams out so there's not a fold right there. And that everything's together. And just kind of pressing it with my finger, or you can use an iron. As I go through this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch this about 1/8 of an inch to keep those seams down together. So once again, I'm going to actually start my stitching here at the edge and then do a top stitch 1/8 of an inch to the edge of this. And I'm using my little guide right here as 1/8 of an inch. And adjusting when I need to adjust. And this is the bottom. And now you can see it's top stitch. You really can't see it on the front of the fabric. You can see it a little bit right there, but it's blended in really nicely. It's there. It helps when you wash it. It'll help keep the seams from fraying. So the next thing that we need to do is make the casing for the elastic or the t-shirt material, whatever you're deciding to do. You can either use an iron, or I'm just going to show you how to finger press it to make it really quickly. If you're doing a lot, I would do an iron just to get that nice crisp seam there. So what you want to do is take the edge and fold it down about 1/4 of an inch. And then you're just going to take your fingers and press that down. And then I'm going to take that piece and fold it over about 3/4 of an inch here. And you can eyeball it. You don't want it to be too wide or too narrow. You need to be able to get elastic through there. So just keep that in mind. So if it's too narrow, it won't work out very well for you. And if it's too wide, you're leaving a lot of your face exposed. So there it is. And I'm going to sew this down now. And typically what I would do is I would press that with an iron, but finger pressing seems to be okay for now. And I'm sewing it about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. So about right here is my guideline. And I always just do a back stitch. And there, our casing is done. And you want to do that for both sides. But I've already done it for the other side, so that's what that looks like. And now I can insert elastic or something else to tie it up, and I'll explain that in the next scene. So here's our finished mask. It's 2 layers of cotton fabric. And now we just need to do something so that we can attach it to our face, like this. When I first started making these, I could not find elastic anywhere. If you can find elastic, 1/4 inch elastic works very well. And all you'll do is feed it through the casing. You can tie it off and you can have it go over your ears. And I've seen it where it goes, they've had it be a longer piece and it goes on the top of your head and behind your head. And I feel like that works very well for children. However, I still can't find elastic. So one option is to use a shoelace. So if you have shoelaces, that's a pretty easy option. They can go in the wash and the dryer pretty easily, like that. But the other thing that I found that worked really well was just using a simple t-shirt. And I use the t-shirts that don't have the seams on the side, so it's kind of like a big tube. They're cotton or cotton poly mixes, and I cut them about 1 inch wide, like this. And I have a rotary cutter and a ruler, so I can do it pretty precisely. And then all I do is stretch it out. And so here is my tie. And this is great because this does not fray at all. And you can tie it off and throw it in the wash and it's good to go. And so what I do is I have a big needle, but you could use a safety pin, and I thread my t-shirt yarn. And then what I do is I go through the top and then kind of do a U and go through the bottom back to the top again. And there is my mask. So I have this loop right here, and it actually, I feel like it works well because when I don't need it on, I can just let it hang. And then when I need it, I just put it on my face and tie it at the top like so. Pretty easy. Pretty easy. And then when I'm done with it and I'm ready to throw it in the wash, all I do is I just do a little slip knot here like that and then toss it in my hamper. They wash really easy. I haven't had any problems with the items fraying or anything like that. So that's why I kind of like this idea, this design. There are tons of other designs out there. If you have any questions, feel free to ask us. We'll leave the pattern notes in the comments so you have access to the PDF of the state pattern that we used. And good luck. We hope you enjoyed this for National Sewing Month.